Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, The Roots of Western Civilization. And naturally, my slideshow would not be complete without viewing this. Perfect. Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock wearing Grecian robes. An interesting note, neither of these original costumes has ever been found in private hands, where most of the rest of the Star Trek wardrobe is accounted for. So let's go into our slideshow. By the way, if you like Star Trek, this is from an episode called Plato's Stepchildren. Very weird episode, but you'll love it. This was an interesting note I wanted to make, that people like to tag or write on monuments, Stonehenge, the Colosseum, so I'll put that on your canvas. So this is different parts in history. A single hand stenciled in red paint from deep inside of a cave. A bearded man wearing a long skirt from atop a stepped ancient pyramid from the ancient Iraqi pyramid. A young athletic god from the roof of a marble temple, and a thin woman wearing a crown. All of these images tell us what people of the time appreciated at the time that they were created, what was important to them. So let's look at prehistoric times. Prehistory just means before written recordings. So here we're looking at Grotte Chauvet, which is a cave found in France. Just as Lascaux caves were also found in France, with some of the earliest cave art ever found intact. And what we're seeing here are many things. We're seeing predatory animals and handprints. And if you think about prehistory, you're really thinking about before text. So how do you say, I was here, before you can write your name? You put your handprint on something. So there's evidence of human placement inside of these caves, an artistic impulse. Some people say that these images are made to be instructive. Some say that they are shamanistic with magical properties. And others would say winters are long and boring, and what else was there to do? But that's just the ridiculous part. So what's interesting about Grotte Chauvet is it was found relatively recently in 1994 by spelunkers. Those are people who drop into caves. And they found this discovery, and the third spelunker, Jean-Marie Chauvet, was for whom it was named. But unlike Lascaux, Chauvet is full of principally predatory animals. Snow panther, white rhinoceros, lion, cave bear, things like that. 424 animals, 14 species. The cave has been sealed off to the public since its discovery in 94. But they made a faux Lascaux, or a fake Lascaux cave that people can go into and see, because the question is, this is human history. Would you want to go to France and see something this ancient that has to do with humans in the dawn of time? Maybe there's some sort of feeling that you would get seeing the real thing. But too many tourists march through the Lascaux caves, and because of their exhalations, the paintings, these delicate works, started to flake off of the walls. And so they built an identical cave using the same materials next door that tourists can go through, but without destroying and flaking away these amazing images. So look what we're seeing here. Which is deadlier, a lion or a lioness? This is the deadlier of the two. The female of the species is deadlier than the male. And here is a group of lionesses walking and stalking. And do you see here how the artist used the convex nature of the cave, some indentations that were jutting out to show these giant jawbones here of the lionesses. And if I'm telling you, if you were asked today to draw a lioness, I couldn't do this good of a job. This is beautiful. And look at the shading. And then there's background ochre color mixed in. So it's really amazing. There are parts that are scratched on the one on the right. Here's animals that are fighting. This is obviously a bear, but look at this beautiful shading, and his little snout has a bit of ochre on it. And here is what looks like a rhinoceros. And look, the Earth's earliest Harry Potter fan enjoying what looks like an owl scratched into the wall. And here is a jaguar. I'd like you to look at the trailer for The Cave of Forgotten Dreams, a movie that will just blow your mind. Just the trailer alone, if that doesn't move you, I don't know what will. But here, look at this. Look at this vibrating energy off of this rhinoceros. It's so cool. It looks like it's moving. Let's look at the ancient Sumerians. So if you say the timeline goes, you most typically hear BC and AD, before Christ, and AD after death, or Anno Domini, year of our Lord. Today, you usually say B.C.E, or before the Common Era, and C.E, Common Era, with 0 being the marker between the two, the birth of Christ being 0, and everything is either before that or after that. But when you're saying 3500 BCE, you're saying from where we are today, 2018, back up 2,000 years to 0, and then back up another 3,500 years before that. So we're talking ancient history. And when you think about ancient Sumer, which is an early phase of Mesopotamia, which is, it occupied what is now modern-day Iraq, it was the cradle of civilization. They had an early form of writing called cuneiform and cylinder seals, which is a pre-writing form of signature. So if you were going to trade goods or services, they would have a piece of wet clay and you would say, I so-and-so authorize this trade of, this many gallons of olive oil for this many tanned hides. And you'd press your little cylinder seal across the wet clay and that would be your signature. And you carry this little seal, which is only about the size of the half of your pinky, on a leather thong, and you might wear it as a necklace, or you might carry it on your belt as a tool. And because they were so durable and carried around, they are lost, and they would just make a new one. So they're found everywhere because everybody had one. And oftentimes they have some of the mythological subject matter of the time or rulers of the time depicted in this negative impression that would turn out as a positive when you press it into the clay. And they are often made in beautiful semi-precious stones, lapis lazuli, which is beautiful blue, or moonstone, which is this lovely milky stone here. And if you go to LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, you can see a beautiful display of cylinder seals that they have, and you should really marvel at how small they are and how beautiful the stones are that they used. So when you think about ancient Sumer, you should think about cylinder seals, cuneiform, or their wedge type of writing, and ziggurats. So unlike what you think of Egyptian pyramids, ziggurats were stepped pyramids. So they are pyramidal in shape. This one actually, because they are made of mud brick, the very top of it has been sheared off by weather. But these would hold giant administration buildings, massive buildings with social organization, stepped pyramids with a temple to the moon goddess Nana at the very top. So this would have been an administrative and religious building, which would have been a huge undertaking. So thousands of people would have used 720,000 baked bricks. So the resources needed to build the ziggurat at Ur are staggering. They would also use bitumen. It's kind of naturally occurring tar in the Near East as a sealant, and that is the same kind of tar you used to seal mummies in ancient Egypt. So this is incredible. So this is a beautiful work of art called the Standard of Ur. And unlike a Roman standard, which would have had an eagle at the top and you would have carried it into battle, this is called a standard, but it really is too big and bulky to be a true standard. Nobody knows what it really is. But what you should be looking at is the inlay. It's like a mosaic or tiny little pieces of stone placed inside to make images. And what you're seeing are tiers of society from the bottom, where you see chariots rolling over conquered foes, bodies with scratches on them. And then you see here people taking the conquered with wounds, see the little bloody wounds, up to the most important person, who would be the ruler, who is bigger than everyone else, which is called hierarchical scale, and is also central. It's in the middle, so that's called centrality. So we see centrality and hierarchy of scale throughout the Middle Ages, actually, until you get to the Renaissance. So it's a very ancient way to determine who is the most important person in an artwork, and I will put this link in your Canvas box. This is cuneiform. This was not created to record stories and history. Mainly it was, again, record keeping. This many piles of grain, this many bottles of beer. And later it became one of the earliest forms of taking down ancient stories. So let's move on to ancient Greece. So ancient Greece, you can think of really coming into its own in 500 BCE. By 145 BCE, the Romans came and completely took over. So their glory days really were 400 BCE, the classical period, and we'll talk about that. But the reason why the term Greco-Roman exists is because when Rome conquers Greece, they saw all of this Greek art and they couldn't believe their eyes. So what they did was they replicated all of this art in Rome. So when you go to a museum and you see something that says a Roman copy of a Greek original, but it's still ancient, it's from, 14 BCE, you're saying, well, wait a minute, it's a copy? That means it's a replica? No, it's still ancient. It means that it's a Roman version of what was originally Greek, but they, like the greatest hits, like if you had, you came to another culture and you loved the Eagles' Hotel California, then there'd be a million cover bands doing Hotel California. That's what Rome did to Greece. They took all of their traditions and made them their own. So, I will put this video up, which is a wonderful and quick guide to the development of Greek and Roman art. It will insult your intelligence. The man who is doing the narration is obnoxious, so please ignore the horrible jokes and just try and get the gist. Is this the Parthenon? No. Why do American federal buildings look Greco-Roman? Because for a relatively new country, being founded way late in the game, it gave America a sense of stability and an illusion of history and the impression of democracy and permanence and weightiness. And so that's why most federal buildings look Greco-Roman. There is actually a simulacrum of the Greek temple, the Parthenon, in Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee. So this is the simulacrum we were talking about last time, like Disneyland, like when you walk into Main Street Disneyland, and the simulation that you're supposed to see is of right before turn of the century America. So that's the simulacrum that is Main Street Disneyland, a simulation of another time. So in Nashville, Tennessee, at this Parthenon that they built, not that one, that's the original, they also put what's missing in the original, which would have been an ivory and gold massive statue of the patron goddess of Athens, Athena, holding in her hand Nike, the goddess of victory, the little winged goddess of victory. So the shoes you're wearing are Nikes. So you'll watch this video about the Parthenon. So the Parthenon sits on the artificially leveled mountain called the Acropolis, where before the Persians had come, sacked Athens, and everybody tried to hide on the Acropolis mountain, and there was a fire and they were slaughtered. So this is built on the scene of slaughter. This temple is dedicated to their patron deity Athena, and it was completely decorated with friezes and metopes. So this is the replica in Tennessee, but this kind of gives you an idea of what it would look like completely intact, with the pediment sculpture intact. See this triangular part? And the metopes are these little squares here, which is usually humans fighting monsters to show the triumph of rationality and logic over madness, which is very Greek, actually. So this is what the pediments would have looked like. This one and this one. And in the video, it will explain to you that this one is showing you the challenge of Athena versus Poseidon to be the patron god of Athens, and what each of them did to try and earn their place, and Athena won. And here you can see some of the existing pediment sculptures as they are in the British Museum, and see, here you can see the reclining figure and the horses still exist. He would have been in the lower corner, right, and some of the female figures standing. Okay, and I think these are these here. So the writing that you will have to do about the Parthenon Frieze and Lord Elgin is about, this is the pediment, and the metopes are here in red, those tiny little battle scenes. And along here is this long narrative relief sculpture that's a ribbon that goes in the inside. It wasn't meant for anyone to see, because you don't enter a Greek temple, actually. Only the priests do. And it was a Panathenaic procession. And so this is what you would have seen. And this is a later painting showing the sculptor Phidias showing off his work in the Parthenon. And what you can see is all of his friends and important people on scaffolding way up high, looking at the finished, which would have originally been painted work. And in the early days of photography, some people were taking photographs of what existed of the Parthenon. And this is what was left on the Parthenon frieze, that thin ribbon inside. See how it's inside of the walls? And it was left over. So Lord Elgin came along, and Greece was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and had been for almost 500 years. So he saw that the Ottomans were using, they had been in charge from the mid-1400s to 1836. They had been using the Parthenon sculptures to be broken up for sale for tourists, to be used for rifle target practice, to be broken up and ground down for lime, for a multitude of different reasons. You can sprinkle lime on graveyards and things like that. And Lord Elgin was horrified. So he gains permission through the government to remove large parts of the pediment sculptures, metopes, and the frieze. So he removes 21 pieces of statuary from the east and west pediments, 15 of the original 92 metopes, mostly from the centaur battles, or man versus centaur, man with a horse's body, and 247 feet of the Parthenon frieze. So the rest of the Athenian marbles disintegrated on the building until the 1990s. So when you hear the Greeks complaining that the British Museum removed these parts in 1805, they were all done by 1805. Remember, the Ottomans are still in charge until 1836, so he couldn't wait until the Greeks were back in charge. And Lord Elgin did this with his own money, and he took a very low offer of money from the British government because he wanted the pieces to be protected. And in 1816, the British government purchased these pieces from Lord Elgin, and that's where they are today. So the big controversy is that Greece wants them back, which raises a lot of questions. Would they have survived in such excellent condition if left on the Parthenon? Remember, huge parts of the Parthenon Frieze were left on the monument until the 1990s. Acid rain has occurred, lots of damage. They're almost unreadable. If the Greeks cared so much, why didn't they just remove that part decades earlier? So you have to take these things with a grain of salt. I like to say that it's like if you had a toy. Some little boy has a toy and he smashes up this little police car, and then he throws it away. And some other kid comes along, rescues the police car, and fixes it, and now it looks nice again. And the first little boy comes back and says, "That's mine." So if Greece has some sort of moral right to have their pieces back from the British Museum, which has had them almost as long as we've been a country, then are the Greeks going to give back all of their Egyptian antiquities back to Egypt? Are all museums supposed to give back everything? Is there world culture or not? Is Grotte Chauvet and the Lascaux caves with all of the prehistoric art, is that France's history or is that world history? Is that human history? So that's the question. If you agree that the Greeks should have the pieces of the Parthenon back because, then you have to have a really good reason because why? Then why doesn't everybody get everything back? So it's interesting. It's a conundrum. And here are some of the beautiful pieces that are in the British Museum today. So what is interesting about this is if you look at men and women, the difference between men and women. So in Greece, male beauty was prized. It was considered the epitome of everything that it is to be human. And look at this detail. You can see the muscles in his knee and this glorious stomach muscles, and this is called Apollo's belt. When you have body fat so low that you have this band of muscle running across your midsection, and the pulling of the muscles in this beautiful, glorious head, and the twisting of the legs. This is as good as it gets. But he's nude. Whereas women are always draped, it was considered outrageous for them to be shown nude. But what you're seeing is called wet drapery. See how you're not seeing everything, but you're seeing a lot? It looks like somebody's misted very thin gauze with water. So it reveals almost as much as it conceals. So it's fun. So of course, when you get to something which seems very mild today, a Venus figure, it's shocking because in Greece you did not show women nude. So when you have the Capitoline Venus, and even though she's being a Venus Pudica or a modest Venus covering up her Mons Veneris, her mound of Venus, it's still shocking because women are shown to be respectable and to be clothed, and men are the only ones to be gloriously nude because, again, male beauty is prized. Later, we'll talk about other fascinating artworks where it is a Venus Pudica. She's hiding herself, but as you can see with Manet's Olympia, is she really making an effort? So we'll talk about that. When you get to the medieval period, really the only female nudity you will see is the Madonna lactans, or the lactating Madonna, the breastfeeding Madonna, shown as a symbol of tenderness and generosity between Mary and Jesus. But really, when you roll into the medieval, that's the last of it. But it's very personal and sweet moment being shown. So this is Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. named after the Roman architect Vitruvius, who set up the ideal of perfect proportion, physical perfection, the magic of the circle and the square, the only two perfect shapes that go on into infinity. And so Da Vinci is answering a riddle. Is the human perfect? Can it fit into the perfect shape? And he's showing that yes, a perfectly proportioned human reflects its perfection bodily. And you see that this is done in 1490, which really you should always remember that the Renaissance is in 1500. So yes, things happened in the 1450s and things happened in the 1550s, but the saddle that you're sitting on is 1500. So we're in the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is very different from the medieval period, when the body is disgusting and you have to hide it. The Renaissance is a rebirth, that's what Renaissance means, of Greek and Roman love of body and of learning and of intellect, right? And then here's all the funny parts, all the Vitruvian Man imitations that have been made. This is the famous turn to page 394 scene in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. And here is poor David Banner turning into the Hulk and Homer Simpson and rock and roll. Plato's Allegory of the Cave. Holy cannoli. You could pretty much sum all of this up saying appearances are deceiving. So I'll show you this weird little video. But basically what it's saying is that people like serenity and they like being in their flow state. It's comfortable there. That's what we were talking about in the chapter 1 lecture, flow state. Very few people wish to question the world around them. So Plato is saying that humans are prisoners in the cave, and a questioner escapes to explore the truth, and a philosopher returns to explain that others are living in an imaginary reality, and he becomes a pariah because people don't like change. So, Robbie. So, what they're saying is you cannot force knowledge into people who left the cave and returned. You can't force knowledge into the people that are there. So in the contrast between truth and representation, everything on earth is a corrupted copy of a perfect original. No reality can compare with the perfection that your mind creates, and the prison house is the world of sight. So nobody likes to hear the truth. There are people who seek truth, and it could be harsh or hard to take, and there are people that are comfortable in the cave. That's what you should take from this. Plato also believed that he liked the oral tradition better than the written word. He thought that it took more talent to try and explain something using your brain other than cobbling together a bunch of words on a page. So Greeks were suspicious of technology. Let's actually go back to this. They believed that the only purpose of technology was to illuminate you and your thought, not the finished product. Many of the Greek writings were preserved and copied into manuscripts during the Middle Ages, but they believed that the purpose of knowledge was to transform you, not to create something. So it was all about your own intellectual growth. So the Greeks into the Middle Ages, the fall of Rome, Western Rome, was 476 CE. So the new Europe is unified now by Christianity. So in 313 AD, Emperor Constantine, with the Edict of Milan, makes Christianity the official religion of Rome. So even after Rome fell, Christianity spreads across Europe. So this is called the Middle Ages, not the Dark Ages, because it was not a dark age. There was all sorts of things going on. Feudalism fell to capitalism. Art transitions from very literal recreations of bodies, like that beautiful Apollo figure we saw from the head, the pediment of the Parthenon, to almost cartoon-like figures, representations of bodies. They had a love of geometry. They loved to try and explain the natural world through geometry. Because geometry would explain order behind chaos, that the circle and the square and God's perfection can be seen and rationally understood if you pay attention. They love to explain natural order in forms. So we can look at the notebooks of Villard d'Ionnecourt. He looked at physiognomy, or how the face is arranged. He looked at vegetal forms, and he kept notebooks because he was an architect of cathedrals. So you can see some of his cathedral work, but also you can see the medieval love of geometry to try and explain and rationalize the world and how and the science behind the creation. And some of his artworks can be goofy or even ugly, but what's interesting about them is you can see these aren't for public consumption. He wasn't making these for anyone. He was trying to do an intellectual exercise to understand the nature between vegetable and person, or how the scrolling acanthus leaf decoration from ancient Greece and Rome could possibly translate into physiognomy or study of the human form, or is there geometry to life, right? Wrestling men, here's a design for a cathedral. So the medieval mind is trying to understand. So what Greek culture saw, which was technology, as a threat to human freedom, the Middle Ages saw it as a source of liberation. It no longer is just about transforming you, it's about ordering the universe. And so that's why often you see in the medieval period Christ as the geometer, or Christ ordering the world in a very logical way using scientific tools. It's taking it away from being magical and into rationality and order, moving toward the Renaissance. But you have to remember, in the medieval period, body is bad, heaven is good, right? But you see the beginning of pilgrimage churches, going from Spain's Santiago de Compostela and hitting all of these little churches, all of which would have their own holy relics or pieces of either the actual body of saints or some of their clothing, and you would stop at each place and pray and worship and move all the way up to Chartres Cathedral in France, which was the other holy place, right? So it's total pilgrimage. So if through the medieval period you were able to deny your physical earthly existence, your suffering would be removed in the afterlife. So don't look at your body. Your body isn't important anymore. This isn't Greco-Roman celebration of the body. Your body is a sin-filled sack of goo. Ignore it, and you will have your just reward, right? Because your time on earth is finite, but you will be tormented by demons forever if you don't live right. So during the Gothic period, cathedral building exploded because they thought that there was going to be an apocalypse at the year 1000, just like we thought that there was going to be an apocalypse at the year 2000, if you remember. So cathedral buildings were central and dominant in a medieval town, as a ziggurat in ancient Sumer would have been able to be seen from miles around, just like Chartres Cathedral would have been. And the majority of these had stained glass windows. This is called a rose window, or an oculus, like an eye. And Chartres is interesting, and if you ever get it on a test, you can always tell it's that, because on its facade, or the face of the cathedral, here's a low Gothic tower with very little ornamentation, and built about 100 years later is a high Gothic tower full of ornamentation. They didn't match the two. They just kind of went with the style that was prevalent at the time. And as you would go on these pilgrimages to churches and cathedrals, you actually could pick up souvenirs. And one of the souvenirs you could take was a woodcut, right? So a little paper woodcut And you can kind of carry it along to protect you, because as you can imagine, the pilgrimage road would be full of thieves and cut purses and cutthroats and horrible people, like any time you travel. So the sacred geometry of Chartres Cathedral, again, the love of geometry, the harmony of the circle and square, all created with 3 doors to represent the Trinity, geometric balance, to try and show the relationship between the sacred geometry of the circle and the square and physical geometry of the earthly realm. And so then you get to the rose windows of Chartres. And it's amazing. So light would represent godliness and the presence of a supernatural force. And so the more light you allowed into what would have been, in the Romanesque period, a very dark place, the more light you pierce, the more heavenly the space becomes. And so these Gothic churches are full of stained glass windows and see, these are these rose windows and lancets. These are the kind of lance-shaped little, cuts. And they're beautiful, and it would have been a very kind of new technology, not only made with glass, but also there's painting over them to create detail, the fine details such as eyelashes. So many rose windows. And what's interesting is, here's a Last Supper scene, and here are, what are they called? Astrological symbols that are held over from things that you would have seen in the Greco-Roman times. And they appear in churches. They also appear on tympanum sculpture. So this is the Second Coming of Christ tympanum from Chartres Cathedral. And most often during the medieval period, the whole idea was to keep you free from sin for a week. So tympanum sculptures were often terrifying. They're often the Last Judgment, not just the Second Coming, where the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are accompanying a Christ enthroned inside of a mandorla, or this almond shape, holding up a sign of benediction. So he's sort of neutral. It would have been terrifying, with demons and judging the souls, and really horrifying, because it was meant to frighten you into being sin-free for an entire week. And what's interesting about this and Chartres Cathedral, and here are these massive jamb figures, like door jambs, which also look down at you as you come through this portal representing the Trinity, right, the 3, is the inclusion of Mary. See the seated Mary with the Christ child, and it's called a Majesta, or a Majesty. Mary, during the medieval period, this very harsh period where you're going to go to hell, your soul is going to be damned, Mary was a kindly intercessor that was saying, it's going to be okay. I will put in a good word for you. I'll be the mother of you and protect you during this frightful time when you die, and I will lead you to heaven. So she's this sweet voice at a time when really you got a lot of death and damnation and sin and fear, which is why there are so many churches called Notre Dame, or Our Lady. Our Lady being Mary. It's called the cult of Mary, this rising yearning for a kindly presence in religion without all of this fire and brimstone. And the faces on Chartres Cathedral also begin to change. So it's not so much these normalized, regular faces, and we're far, far away from Greek physicality, because you can see these strange medieval, regular folds in the garment that are completely unnatural. There's not really a body underneath here. They're all kind of regulated. The toes are pointy. They don't feel like they're really holding weight. But you're starting to see sweeter faces greeting you. They look like individualized and intelligent, and they're being sweet to you, which is what you want. And again, I wanted to remind you how funny it is to see a low Gothic spire and a high Gothic spire both on one building. That's Chartres Cathedral. And so you have other jamb figures which start to flesh out more. So you see there's a little elbow here. The cloth folds in a more naturalistic way. So we're moving out of this this body doesn't matter portion of the medieval, and into a kind of a more of a meditation of how do people really stand and hold their weight, how do garments really fold, and how do people really look. And this will achieve complete fruition in the Renaissance period. And so finally, let's see. Finally, you get monasteries and monastery work. During the Middle Ages, there was a flood of technological innovations. Monasteries would create treatises on preservation of youth and science. They would write about how to make beer and raise livestock. So it really was a time of learning. And it's funny because all of this leads into the human drive to create more and more realistic pictures and images for consuming. Just as the Sumerians created votive figures, humans continue to create entertainment. From Lascaux caves and seeing bulls and bisons go by, and can you imagine sitting in the dark and all you had is a torch and you're watching these animals go by and the person is telling the story or kind of conveying something? It would have been terribly exciting, and it's not very much different than sitting in a darkened theater watching the Avengers run by. It's exciting, and it's life and death and sex and violence and everything that makes art history so much fun. So that's the end of chapter 2. I hope this made sense, and I will see you in chapter 3. So please don't be medieval, be Renaissance, I guess.